QSO Today, episode 406, Jerry Arnold, K9AF. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Just a note, I'm cleaning up the QSO Today email list, and I think that there's a number of you that are not receiving email messages from me because they go into your spam box instead of your inbox. If this is so, I will put instructions on the QSO Today show notes under the Ham Radio Workbench banner to give you instructions on how to unblock my email messages to you. If you have decided to not receive my email messages, please use the unsubscribe link at the very bottom of my messages rather than mark me as a spammer. Jerry Arnold, K9AF, is a longtime commercial broadcaster as well as an amateur radio operator, originally from Southern California and now living in Terre Haute, Indiana. While Jerry likes to operate CW, he has also restored an AM broadcast transmitter on 160 meters to transmit that warm AM sound that we like to hear. K9AF and I discuss a whole range of ham radio topics in this QSO Today. K9AF, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Jerry?
Yes, 4Z1UG is K9AF. Go ahead, Eric.
Jerry, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, I was in high school in Glendale, California, and I was kind of looking for a hobby. And the only thing I'd ever done before was collect coins, which there's nothing wrong with that, but it just wasn't real fulfilling, having a bunch of basically metal money sitting in folders somewhere, even though I looked at them once in a while. In fact, I still got a few of them, but not many. And I happened to see in our local newspaper that a local radio club was offering a free, that hit me, class to get your ham radio license. So a friend of mine and I talked it over. He was interested too. So we both went up to the meeting, which was at the Crescenta Valley Radio Club. And even though it was technically La Crescenta, California, they met in Montrose, which is just down the road from La Crescenta. We got involved there and took the novice test, and that was in early November of 1969, and it's been there ever since.
Why did you think that you had to have a hobby in those days? Was there something about the time, or did everybody have hobbies? Because it seems to me that nobody has hobbies these days.
Well, yeah, I guess so. I was 18 years old, and while I was still playing baseball, something I did for many, many years after that, I wanted something to do when I was home. And I was still in high school, so I hadn't even started college yet. Once I got to college, I thought, am I going to have time for college and ham radio? But yes, I worked it into that. But it's not that I felt I had to have a hobby. I just wanted something else, and electronics. And the real reason I got into ham radio wasn't that I needed a hobby. It was that my parents had been married in 1938, and one of their wedding gifts was a 1938 RCA floor console radio. I used to know the model number, but I don't recall it now. It was AM and 2 shortwave bands, and my parents had kept that packed away, kind of sentimental value, and I asked Dad if I could put it in my bedroom, and he said sure, and we put a hunk of wire on it, ran it out the window and up to a tree, and while I enjoyed shortwave listening, a lot of it was in foreign language, which I couldn't understand, but that radio was absolutely a killer on the AM broadcast band, so I started broadcast band DXing. Then I saw the article in the newspaper, and I thought, I could be part of some of this stuff I'm hearing. So it was kind of a tie into that.
You grew up in Southern California. California was car culture. And if you were an 18-year-old in Southern California, you probably had an interest in whatever your drive was, perhaps?
Yes, but only from a transportation standpoint. I was never a hot rod type guy. I had a car. I even had a motorcycle. I rode the motorcycle more than I drove the car.
Were you on the baseball team in your high school? Did it look like that you could go on and be a baseball player in college?
Well, to answer that question, yes, although I didn't get to play in high school. I didn't get to play until I was in college, and I played there and kept on with it. And I actually ended up playing for a year in the Pittsburgh Pirates farm organization.
When you say farm organization, that's like a minor league team?
Yes, that's how they, back then, colleges were part of their recruiting, but not as much as it is now. They had many, many more minor league teams from which to draw their players when they got good enough up to the majors. Obviously, I never made it to the majors, but that's okay. But football, by comparison, has always drawn 100% of their players from high school and then colleges.
You have this newfound interest in shortwave listening, AM broadband DXing. Did that interest and that new interest in amateur radio make a difference in terms of what you chose for your education and career?
Well, surprisingly enough, Eric, it did. At that time, I was wanting to be a forest ranger. And part of the California education system, there's so many branches of the University of California and the State University of California that one of them, at least back then, had a huge forestry school in it. And I thought that'd be just a lot of fun. Talked to my dad about it, and he said, well, I can understand that. Might be okay. So that's what I was thinking about. But my dad gave me some sage advice. He said, go to a couple years of college before you decide what you want to spend the rest of your life doing. And I thought that was pretty good. And it was actually in college where I thought, well, maybe forestry isn't the thing for me. And the electronic angle of what you had to learn to get your license, or licenses, I should say, matriculating up the steps, was interesting enough that it said, well, maybe there's a future for me in some kind of electronics. And then since I'd become such an avid broadcast bandy extra, I thought maybe broadcast and the electronic aspect of that, or just the entire aspect of it.
Where did you do the first couple of years of college?
Well, we had a junior college in my hometown. It was called Glendale Junior College. It had been started in the 30s, and my parents insisted I go there since I could walk to school. It was somebody that rode my motorcycle down there, but it was only about 3/4 of a mile from my house. So I went there for 2 years and discovered that college did not have any either open circuit or broadcast or even closed circuit radio stations. So I met with with one of the speech teachers and asked about that, and she encouraged me to follow up, and we did a whole lot of work. Never got one on the air because by that time the airwaves in the LA basin were so crowded there was not an assignment left. But we did do some closed circuit broadcasting there in the college campus. It's something I started. I don't know if they're still doing it or not.
So closed circuit means like AC power line carrier?
We weren't even that advanced. There was a intercom system that you could turn up or even off in most of the rooms. Normally, there was a study hall that was taken in the auditorium, and they had one there. That was the main place that was kept on all the time, although other rooms could turn it on if they desired.
Oh, okay. So it was part of a public address system. So you're broadcasting over PA.
Pretty much so, yeah.
And what kind of programming did you create for that station?
Well, most of it was information-based. It was kind of like we were kind of the first all-news radio station in Los Angeles, as it were, because we did mostly news of what was going on at Glendale College, their sports, but we didn't limit it to just sports. We did a lot of stuff on academia, too. When
we first started, you said that you ended up in Terre Haute kind of right after that. So how did that transition happen?
Well, after 2 years at Glendale College, and I was on the baseball team there, I was a few credits short of having enough to transfer to the University of California, or a branch thereof, as a junior. So I went one more year to Pasadena City College in Pasadena. The reason I did that is they had a full broadcasting department and had an FM transmitter. It was a call sign then was KPCS. And so I got some hands-on both in radio and TV. The TV was kind of fun, but I knew that radio was my first love.
You finished there at Pasadena City College. Then did you transfer to the University of California after that?
Yes, I went to Cal State Northridge out in the San Fernando Valley to finish up. And it was funny. I know everybody can cite professors or teachers they like and ones they didn't. I learned the most of my trade at Pasadena State College. Glendale, I don't blame them because they didn't have one. That was just a basically general education requirement stuff, which was necessary, and I understand that. Cal State Northridge was kind of, okay, here's the stuff, here's what you got to do, write it down, don't bother me again until the end of the year was most of the professors' attitude there. But, okay, and it's funny because by that time I'd gotten a job in my hometown radio station, KIEV, which is 870 on your radio dial. It had gone on the air in 1931, and it was in the Glendale Hotel building at that time, where their in fact, at that time, it was their only studios. And, of course, I was just sweeping the floor and cleaning up, kind of, what most kids would do. I'd started there when I was 16, part-time, and I never did get more than part-time there, but at least I was around a radio station. But what I picked up from broadcasting at that time, by the time I got to Cal State Northridge, what they taught you was what they thought you needed to know to work in it. I had to learn it so I could pass the courses and then totally forget it when I went to work, because that's not how broadcasting was working by that time.
You could only have the novice license for 1 year before you had to upgrade. So what happened?
Well, okay, I really dove into my novice license with both feet, as you might say. My first transmitter was an ICO 720, which, believe it or not, if you watch some of the episodes of the old Andy Griffith show, he has one sitting on a table off to the side, allegedly as his police transmitter, which is funny because the 720, while it would run AM with an external modulator, it was basically a CW-only crystal-controlled 80 through 10 meter rig, which a friend of mine loaned me. He said, now, I'm loaning this to you for no more than 1 year, meaning wanting me to upgrade, of course. I want it back when you've upgraded. I thought, okay, fair enough. And then I bought a used Hamlin HQ110 receiver, which was a very, very good ham bands only receiver, covered 160 through 6 meters in one box, and had that going. And, of course, the novice back then could only run CW. And so I really got into that. And then the American Radio Relay League came out a year later with that 5-band worked all states. I worked like the devil to get that. I had worked all states on 40 and on the 40-meter novice band before I was done. Kept on trying it after I upgraded to general, and never did achieve it, but came pretty close. The big problem was getting the really close in states on 10 meters and 15 meters, because the skip was normally never that short, but occasionally you'd have a sporadic E opening and get one. But I upgraded to general in June of 1970. Back then, if you had a novice and you upgraded to general or anything higher, they just changed the second letter, so the N got dropped and replaced with an A. So I was WA6 MVP from June of 1970 for many, many years. In fact, I didn't change my call sign until I moved to Indiana. I didn't move here till 1979. I didn't change the call sign until I upgraded to extra, and by that time I had already passed the advanced out in California.
I ran into an article in the QST archive that you wrote in 1969 when you were a novice about a 2-band vertical antenna that looks like you mounted it on the side of your house. It was clever, and what struck me was the parts cost. Do you remember the article?
Yes, I do. It was just made out of aluminum tubing, and actually that wasn't my house. That was WN6MBO's house, the father's house, where he lived.
What was interesting about the parts list is you've got, 3 aluminum tubes and some other assorted grommets and sheet metal and stuff. And I think it was like $4.20 in those days for that whole thing. And I thought, wow, that aluminum now, I think you'd probably spend a couple $100 for that aluminum.
Well, yeah, that's price gouging for you.
What I thought was interesting was that you were willing to kind of share in the amateur radio fraternity on QST in your first year. What caused you to start writing articles for QST?
Well, that's a good question, Eric, but I'm not sure there's any one answer. But one thing, I was an ARL member, so I got QST in the mail, and lots of stuff there was antenna-oriented, which that's great, but it was way above most entry-level people's ability to understand what was going on. And back then, a lot of kids were getting in as novices. Not that there weren't adults too, but most kids back then, minimum wage was around $1 an hour, and so you just didn't have the money to put in even commercially made vertical, like the high gain high,
or even the 4BTV in those days.
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
I think that was still around in those days.
Yeah, so I thought, well, okay, this was pretty easy, and I understood it, and the math, there was very little math involved with it. There was more, you were more involved with your hacksaw than you were with math on that, so it was easy to put up, and it worked really well. So I thought, let's tell people about it.
What was interesting about that vertical antenna is it was actually mounted on the side of the house,
right?
Which kind of had me thinking that perhaps it would pick up a lot of electronic noise, and then I realized probably in 1969 the only electronic noise might be an occasional electric mixer.
Pretty much so. The power lines were pretty quiet back then, and so yes, verticals do pick up more man-made noise because most man-made noise tends to be vertically polarized, but still it worked on 40 and on the third harmonic as a three-quarter wave on 15, and since those are two novice bands, you buy $4 worth of tubing and a few other parts and stick it together and put it up and adjust it to resonance, and it works fine, and it's better than almost any wire antenna that you could put up at any height.
And now this message from ICOM America. Field Day is coming on June 26th and 27th, and since it is ham radio's most popular event, you can be a Field Day leader with ICOM. Connect with nature, connect with friends. You will easily cut through the pileups with a powerful and high-quality ICOM base station, the popular ICOM IC705 portable, the ICOM IC7300, and the ICOM IC7610 SDR transceivers are the clear choice for contesters and DXers across the globe. The ICOM IC705 is the perfect transceiver for hams who enjoy both the indoors and the great outdoors on field day. It is the perfect contesting companion because this base station provides features and functionality at the tip of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters, and it weighs in at just under 2 pounds. Features include a 4.3-inch touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall display, 5 watts with the BP272 battery pack, and 10 watts with a 13.8-volt DC power source. Single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functionality. Micro USB connector, Bluetooth, wireless LAN, and micro SD card slot are all standard equipment. Integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger. And the HM243 speaker microphone is standard equipment. The ICOM IC705 has new accessories now available. The MBF705 desktop stand for just the right viewing angle on your desk, and the AH705 optional automatic antenna tuner that covers 1.8 MHz to 50 MHz bands with a 30-meter or 100-foot or longer wire antenna. The ICOM IC7300 is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed your expectations. This innovative HF transceiver digitizes RF before various receiver stages, reducing the generated inherent noise in different IF stages. This radio changed the way that entry-level HF transceivers are designed. Features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen display, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. I have the ICOM IC7300, and it is by far the best HF transceiver that I have ever owned. It is always listening to 20-meter CW while I work. The ICOM IC7610 is the SDR transceiver that every ham wants. This high-performance SDR has the ability to pick out faint signals in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that has changed the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. Features include, but are not limited to, RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receivers, you can be in 2 places at once, and dual digicell. For more information, click on the banner ad in this week's show notes page to get to the ICOM America website and its fine line of amazing amateur radios. And when you finally go to buy your next ICOM radio, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. Now, when you upgraded to General the following year, did you upgrade the station as well?
Yes, I did. And I traded back then, amateur electronics only had one place. It was in Milwaukee, and it had been there for many, many years. And they were one of the few ham dealers that would take trade-ins, believe it or not. And that's where I bought the Hammerlin receiver, and they told me I paid $99 for that in 1969. They said, if within 3 years, assuming it's still working, you ever want to trade it on any new piece of equipment, we'll give you the full amount you paid for it on trade. I thought, well, that's fair enough. So I bought a Swan 270, which I still have, believe it or not. It's out in the garage. I use it as my Elmering rig, and traded in the HQ 110. I wish I still had it. And they gave me, I paid $99 for it, and they gave me $150 trade toward that Swan. I thought that was really fair of them, and got that, and thought that was the neatest thing in the world. It would still work CW, of course, which that was fun, and it was single sideband. So for the next year, I don't say I didn't work any CW, but I didn't work near as much as I did single sideband because, wow, I've got a license now that I can work both. See, I moved to Indiana in 1979, and the Swan, which I'd bought brand new in 1970, of course, at that time, I was only 9 years old. Technology had not advanced near as quickly as it has been since, but I was still using that as my main rig. And you'll say, well, how'd you get a 160? Because it didn't cover it. Well, you're right. While I was still in California, I had this great building phase in my career where I always liked the idea of transceiving converters, because the ARL handbook and some other publications had lots of those, and it seemed like an easy thing to do. And so I built 3 of them. The first one, which I still have in a box out in the garage attic, it was too sentimental to throw it away, was a 160-meter transceiving converter that used 40 meters as a variable IF. 7 megahertz equaled 1.8. I had a 5.2 megahertz crystal oscillator, and I beat the 7 against the 5.2 and took the difference frequency, amplified it up with a pair of 1625 vacuum tubes, 807s with a 12-volt filament, and put out an honest about 70 watts, and it worked real well.
How did you end up going to Indiana? Was this a professional move?
Yes. My degree was in broadcasting, and I had worked, like I said, at my hometown radio station. And after after I got out of college, I started applying and got a job in Bishop, California, which is halfway between L.A. and Reno on U.S. Highway 395. It was a beautiful setting in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and they had one radio station there, which is still there. At least it was of 2019, because I drove by it. It's still in the same building, KIBS AM. They have since added an FM. They didn't have the FM when I was there. It was 1230 on your AM dial, and it was the only radio station for at least 170 miles in any direction because of how remote Bishop, California was. So that was my first move away. And then, of course, knowing I wasn't going to stay there all my life because, A, the pay was miserable, but it did give me some full-time commercial radio experience.
I think Bishop is on 395. It's halfway between Los Angeles and all the ski resorts.
Yeah, around Lake Tahoe, yeah.
That's what I remember. If you were headed to Mammoth Lakes for skiing or something like that from L.A., Bishop was like where you stopped for coffee.
That's exactly, and gas, too.
Because you needed gas and coffee when you were going north and south.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Mammoth Lakes, because I skied there many, many years. So
it is a lovely spot. It's not the end of the world, but I think you can see the end of the world from there.
Yeah, if you get high enough on the Sierras, you can see it from there. Yeah.
You're a broadcast engineer. You end up going to Terre Haute?
Well, I didn't come here as a broadcast engineer. I had done some disc jockeying at KIBS and Bishop and thought I was pretty hot stuff. I wasn't, but I thought I was. And so I remember what I had done back at Glendale Junior College and thought that radio news might be something, even an event prior to me even getting into high school. It kind of formulated that. The first report of John F. Kennedy's assassination that I heard on the radio, on CBS radio, and it was Dan Rather reporting from Dallas that President Kennedy had been shot. And I was so impressed with his report, I thought, maybe I could do that. So that's one thing. When I went to Pasadena City College, I did their news and their sports and of course, I took engineering classes as well. I didn't do any engineering at Pasadena. I was on-air news and sports, and I had one air shift where it was so old-fashioned you had to submit your script to the professor, and he had to approve it, which is everything you said and all the music you played. Wow. At that time, I hadn't had enough real-world experience to realize that they don't do that way anymore, but I did it. So when I came to Terre Haute, I had already worked in Indiana for a while at WILO, AM and FM in Frankfort, Indiana, as their news director. It was a little town of about 12 to 15,000 in northwest Indiana, and had the owner also was a ham. He has since passed. His call was W9FAM. He went by Father and Mother, and while he liked the fact I had a ham license, of course that's not why he'd hired me, naturally. But I knew it was time to leave there when, after working a 3 80-hour weeks and a 100-hour week in a row, he told me he didn't think I was working enough. I thought, So I applied for a position down here in Terre Haute. By that time, I'd had several contacts. The most significant one was the United States Congressman John A. Myers, who at that time, both Terre Haute and Frankfort, Indiana, were in the same United States congressional district. So that's how I got to meet him. And I sent my audition tape and my resume to these people here in Terre Haute. Well, they called me back day after they got it and said, we're kind of interested in you. Could you send us some references? And I said, sure. So I thought, who do I send? So I thought, well, what the heck? I didn't want to put down Congressman Myers' name without alerting to that fact. So I called his office in Washington, knowing I wouldn't get to talk to him, and left a message with one of the interns there who answered the phone. And he said, I'll make sure the congressman gets your message right away. And I thought, boy, I sure hope so. And 15 minutes later, the phone rings, and guess who it is on the phone? Congressman Myers calling me from the floor of Congress. I thought, wow, that's impressive. And he said, well, sure, I remember you, Jerry. I'd love to have you back in broadcasting in Terre Haute. Which station? And I told him, oh, I know the owners very well. I'll call, as soon as I hang up with you, I'll call him and I'll give him a real good report. And he did. And the next day I get a call from the radio station saying, we want to hire you. He's got the John Myers thinks you're the reincarnation of Edward R. Murrow. So I moved here. And by that time I was married and had a kid and another one on the way. And I was wanting to put down some roots somewhere. So that's kind of why I stayed here.
But you're still there. So it seems to me that career in Terre Haute lasted a long time.
Oh, yeah. In fact, I just retired a couple years ago after basically 52 years in broadcasting. Now you say, okay, what about the engineering? Well, back several years ago, a long time ago actually, when the FCC dropped the requirement that you do any public time, most broadcast owners interpreted that FCC rule to mean news. It didn't specifically say news, but it said it was broadcasting in the public interest, which is they interpreted to be news. So at that time, every station that I'd ever heard of had news because it was basically a requirement. And I came here, which was a fairly large step up from Frankfort, Indiana, as news director of WAAC radio. After that gig ended, worked at almost every other radio station here in town, and have been here ever since. So
you've been there since 1979. So you've been there, 40 years?
Over 40 years, yeah.
And you were inducted into the Indiana Broadcasters Association Hall of Fame. How did that go?
The IBA every year puts out letters to the general managers of radio and TV stations asking for nominations for people that you think deserve recognition. And while my general manager didn't do it, one of the other people saw the letter and came to me first and said, I would like to nominate you for the Indiana Broadcasters Hall of Fame, since I've known you for 20 years now, and you've always been really easy to work with and very good at what you do. And I said, would you mind? And I said, well, no, I don't mind, but I doubt seriously if I'm going to get it. Well, he came back to me and asked, for some dates and times of, where I'd worked, stuff like that, to fill out the application. And then he sent it in, and then I get this notification letter from them saying that I was to be inducted in, I think it was October 2008, into their Hall of Fame. And the funny thing is, I was the first person inducted into their Hall of Fame as an engineer.
Now, what does that mean exactly, Jerry? Do they make a wax effigy of you in the Hall of Fame, and it's like a museum that people come to visit?
Well, no wax effigy. I do have a couple of pictures and my name and a very short story, and it is in a museum in Indianapolis. It's part of the Indiana Museum. It's a permanent display about Indiana broadcasting, and anyone who's ever inducted, you can go. I've never seen it. My daughter went there, and in fact, when she goes and takes her friends, she always makes a thing to go by and say, "That's my dad there." And you dial in who you want, push a button, and it plays the short 1-minute piece of the bio of whoever it is and tells about their inducteds into the Hall of Fame.
What's the amateur radio community look like in Terre Haute?
Well, it's kind of split because there's been one club here for many, many years. When I first moved here, or when I would move to any town in broadcasting, I'd check and see how many hams there were. Was there an organized club? What did they do? And things like that. And as part of my job as news director at then WAAC, I had to do a talk show 5 days a week for at least a half an hour. And the owners wanted it kept local, of course. It could have a national twist to it, but if so, they wanted the local angle. So ham radio was as good as any for local, and so that's what I did. I thought, well, let's tell the community about ham radio. So I looked up the local club, called the president of the club, introduced myself, gave my call sign, the whole thing. Oh, that's great, glad, welcome to town. And I said what I was doing, and I would like to have you or somebody you appoint to come on my talk show so we can tell the Terre Haute public about ham radio. And there was just dead silence for about 10, 15 seconds. And then the guy real sternly said, we don't want any other publicity. Thank you very much, and hung up. And I thought, wow, what a jerk. So I thought, fine, I didn't do that. And I found out that attitude was pretty pervasive in that one club. And there was another club, much smaller, and only met sporadically, but they weren't that way. So I got somebody from that club. And believe it or not, 40-some years later, there's still two clubs here. And the first one has softened their tone a bit, but they didn't like outsiders. And I was an outsider since I moved here from California, even though I had an amateur radio license. And then they just had this idea that we don't want anybody outside our own little clique involved. And I thought, okay, that's your loss, not mine. And so that's how I found the community here very divided, and it's not quite as bad now, but it's still pretty divided.
How was your interview show received with the Friendly Amateur Radio Club? Did you receive response from the community? Did it create more hams?
I don't know. We can always hope it did. It was received very well by the second club. They sent their president over, and in fact, I had my note page of what to talk to, and the guy had the gift of gab. I'll say that. I had trouble limiting it to a half an hour, but we did, and they were very, very happy with it. They'd gotten some notoriety on the public airwaves.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. As a news station and as a person who's a ham radio operator, did you also create, say, field day coverage promoting the annual field day? Was there any activity in terms of the ham radio operators being part of either emergency services or supplying communications for public events in Terre Haute?
Field day, no, but public events, yes. We had a flood here once. It was a real lollapalooza, and the Red Cross went out. Of course, the ham community supported the Red Cross with lots of radios and things like that. So we did several reports of the hams helping out the Red Cross in not only search and welfare stuff, but providing stuff to the workers, hot coffee and stuff like that, to the people who are searching for the people who are displaced by the floods and stuff like that. So yes, there was a number of stories for several days that dealt directly or indirectly with ham radio.
What is your favorite operating mode these days?
CW, it always has been. I've made more contacts on CW than any other mode. I have, as you can see behind me here, the TS570, and I do work single sideband on occasion. And I have the first AM transmitter that was ever, let me rephrase it, first AM commercially made transmitter that was ever put on in Terre Haute out in a building outside that I've converted to 160. So I also work 160 AM with a Gates BC 250L, the station that went on the air. The first station in Terre Haute went on the air in 1927 with a homemade transmitter, which they used all the way until 1955 when they put this one on. And they only used that for 3 years because it was a 250-watt rig, and they finally got okayed by the FCC to go to 500 watts, and so they used this as a standby. Nice thing is they had a fairly large engineering staff back then that was able to do the proper maintenance on it and actually put it on the air and ran it for an hour every week, which is one of the best things you can do for a broadcast transmitter. So when that station finally went dark, I bought it, and it still made the rated power and the rated efficiency, and converting it to 160 was a real breeze.
Do you use it from the operating position that you're in now, or do you actually have a separate 160-meter AM broadcast area?
No, it's right here. I have a little homemade control panel that all it does is turn the filament on and off, the plate on and off. I use my Kenwood as the receiver, which I have the AM filter in it, and it works quite well. It's out back, and you'll get a kick out of this, Eric. The way I monitor it is I have a infrared security camera out there pointed at
the meters.
Well, there's many meters on a broadcast transmitter.
Right.
But I have this one. I've got a old-fashioned thermocouple RF ammeter in line with the antenna. My antenna is exactly 50 ohms. I know that for a fact. And I have an AM 80 broadcast band modulation monitor. So I have that camera pointed at that, and it'll see both of them. I run the video out of the camera to an old standard cable TV modulator set up on channel 13. That's the old NTSC system. And inside here, I have a little black and white TV that sits on top of my Tentex Centurion back here, tuned to channel 13 with a whip on it. And I can visually watch my modulation and the RF out of the transmitter that way.
Now, you use some kind of like two-wire control of the transmitter, so your audio comes from your workstation. Yeah,
the mic amp I'm using now, which is a Behringer Ultra Gain Mic 100, it uses a 12AT7, believe it or not, in it, which you can buy today. I do that to send line level audio out to shielded cable out to the transmitter, where it goes into a bit of audio processing and then right into the transmitter.
Now, do you belong to a 160 AM net?
No, I don't always get on. They don't have that many nets, and I've never ever been real big on nets because if you have 2 or 3 people, it's great. We used to call those round tables. Well, then you get more and more and more to the point where it's 16, 18, 20 people. Everybody wants to talk, and nobody wants to listen. And even if they do have it where, okay, you turn it over to 4Z1UG when you're done, Jerry, it might be an hour before it gets back to you. So net operation has never really interested me because while I understand why nets were started originally, especially the public service angle of them, most of them were turned into something you can say, oh, I'm here. I don't have anything to add, but I'm here. Well, to me, that's just a waste of RF.
You're a collector of radio receivers, old radio receivers in wooden cases. What do you have back there?
Well, those were my late uncle's. He and I shared love. In fact, I've had a business out in my garage. This is the 50th year I've had it. Not at this site. I've only been here 27 years, but where I repair antique radios and phonographs, the vacuum tube variety. And those that you see in the camera were my uncle's. There's let's see, the one on the top shelf between the two horns is an Atwater Kent. I've Model 20, but I'm not sure. And the others, one's a Greeby, and I don't remember what the other one is. But those were my uncles, and my cousin, his only child, when he passed away at age 98, wanted me to have them because he put it in his will that I was to have them. So I have them up there in remembrance of my uncle.
And the business doing these antique radio repairs, you say that you've closed this business now, or you're still doing it?
Oh, no. In fact, I've got a 1938 Zenith console out there on the bench right now, one of the clamshell dial type.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm giving you an opportunity. Do you want to say what the name of your company is, what your business is?
Oh, sure. It's a Thermionic Antique Radio Repair. Thermionic is actually a British term because British used to call vacuum tubes thermionic valves. Thermi from the heat, onic from electronic.
Yes, and Grayson Evans calls them thermotrons. I just saw Grayson at the Hamvention. Okay, Thermionic Antique Radio Repair.
Right.
I'll get a link for you, put in the show notes page. Could they also buy equipment like this from you as well? Do you have like a whole warehouse full of old stuff, or do you just repair?
No. Oh, no. People find it interesting that I repair but don't collect, which is kind of rare in the antique radio business, but I just don't have any interest in it, nor do I have any room to put anything like that. The ones I have here are here for sentimental value only.
Do you still find that there's a lot of people that uncover these radios either in an attic or a storage area or something like that, and they want these radios repaired?
Yes, they do. Most of them are what I call nostalgia repairs. They remember Aunt Susie and Uncle John having us in the parlor when they go visit, and remember sitting around it and, gosh, wouldn't it be neat if it could work again? Well, it can. And when the Wuhan virus struck so hard, more people staying home, they started looking for stuff that they'd been putting off. And although that affected my phonograph repair more than anything else, for almost the entire year of 2020, I was just hammered with business, which, gee darn. But most of them wanting to get their phonographs repaired because we have two local Walmart superstores here in Terre Haute, and they both have, a couple years ago, dropped carrying any musical CDs, but a year ago they put back in a vinyl section, and it's growing.
And that's 33 RPM. So when you're talking about repairing phonographs, you could be referring to phonographs that are not 70, 80 years old, but phonographs that are probably newer, right?
Oh, yeah. The guts of a phonograph haven't changed dramatically in 100 years, but just the speed you're turning the turntable is the main thing, and how you're picking it up. But, yeah, I get a lot of people who had bought a yard sale, one of those early 1970s home entertainment units that had a phonograph on top and AM/FM records, sometimes an 8-track, sometimes a cassette, sometimes nothing else. And they have a stack of records, and they want that thing to still be able to play the records.
Now, I've come across a number of companies that repair antique radios, and what some of them do is they keep the case, so they'll refurbish the case so the case looks antique, but they'll replace the electronics with like a Bluetooth receiver, an amplifier, or something like that. Do you do that, or do you actually restore it to its original operation like it's an AM radio or it's an AM/FM radio?
Yeah, I only do original restoration. To me, doing that with Bluetooth is kind of like taking a 1937 panel delivery and turning it into a rat rod. It's like, to me that's blasphemy. So I get, and I'm not alone in this, I get pretty upset about that. The only thing I will do on that aspect is many radios back then had an RCA jack on the back marked phono, and a position on the band switch where you could put an external phonograph, and all I did was use the internal audio amplification of the radio. Now, back in the 40s, of course, the phonographs were all 78 RPM until roughly World War II time, especially in the 1930s. So the phonographs used a crystal cartridge, which put out about 3 volts of audio. So it takes a higher. So I have made cables for people with an RCA on one end and like a 1/8 inch or was that, a 3.5 millimeter plug on the other end that they could plug into like a electronic device. In fact, one of my very best customers does that for Christmas. She'll plug in her YouTube.
Her smartphone.
Yeah, iPhone or iPad, and she has several old-time radio shows. She does it mainly on every major holiday. Like on Halloween, she'll put in the 1938 War of the Worlds on that, run it into her 1940 RCA radio, turn the lights down, and light the fireplace and play War of the Worlds through a receiver that might well have heard it live.
Now, it seems to me, as I recall playing with some of this stuff, that the new phonograph cartridges, they don't have 3 volts of output, and so you need to build some kind of phonograph preamplifier. Then I discovered finding phonograph preamplifiers is actually pretty hard to do. Do you actually build phonograph preamplifiers, or are you actually finding them?
Well, actually, neither, because like I said, if you use the headphone jack on an iPad and vary the volume, you can get scads of volume out of the radio on that. So, no, and you're right. Today's modern phonograph cartridges put out anywhere from a half volt to 1 volt of audio. So that now some radios that would be enough to drive. I can't say it would be on all, but it would work. But no, I don't build phonograph preamps, or nor do I buy them because I haven't had any need.
What is the significance of Burma shave to you?
Well, as a kid, my parents were both from Ohio. My dad was a school teacher. So every year when school was out, we would pack up the car and drive from L.A. to Ohio, taking Route 66 and Route 40, in fact, even coming right through Terre Haute for that matter. And we'd spend the summer on my grandfather's farm down in southeast Ohio, which I really loved and looked forward to every year. Back then, my real early years were before very much of the interstate highway system got built. And much of Route 66 back then was still 2-lane, lots of traffic, but 2-lane. And we'd see these little Burma shave signs sticking up out of the side. And even if you saw them on the other side, you'd turn around and read them backwards and then put it back together. There's Burma Shave was a company that was founded in 1919 in Minneapolis by a guy who, his father, it was supposed to be the first brushless shaving cream back when you had to use a shaving cream brush and mix your own lather in a cup and slather it on your face and then shave. And they didn't have any money for advertising, so they came with this idea about putting these little pickets along the road on well-traveled roads that had a kind of a clever little jingle to them, and the last one always said Burma Shave. And I remember that so vividly from my childhood that when I moved down where I am now, I've got a fairly long lanes, about a quarter mile long back to my place, so I put a set of Burma Shave signs along there, although I came up with a ham radio jingle. Mine say, for this land, no, let's see, it said, this land is great. No, I'll get it right. It says, 4DX, this land is great. That's why I work them on 1.8, Burma Shave. Made a set of signs and sent the pictures to QST, and they published them.
Well, what other radios do you have in your shack right now?
Well, the only other one I have is a walkie-talkie, which I barely ever use. It's a ICOM ICT-90A. That's how old it is. But it's funny because that is a 3-band transmitter. It's 6, 2, and 440. I've never made a contact on 6 or on 440 on it. Use it on 2 meters a little bit, but the thing I like about it, it's got what we call the DC to daylight receiver in it and an AM detector. And it is really helpful in hunting down noisy power lines, and I've used that many times as the detector for hunting down broadband noise.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now?
Oh, Lord. I think it's twofold. A, even though the numbers are going up, they aren't telling you the whole story. Yes, more people are getting their license, but when they find out how much it costs, that's as far as it goes, because I've heard several millennials say, you mean I got to spend $1,000 for this rig and I might get to talk to somewhere across the ocean? Well, I can pick up my cell phone and do that and be guaranteed of doing it. Okay, they don't. There's no wizardry left to radio on that aspect, and there's not much you can do about to combat that. Two, we've dumbed down the license so far just to get more numbers, in my way of thinking, and that's one of the things that fosters that feeling. And then, of course, there's all sorts of other things that people can do for entertainment, and most people, when they get into ham radio, look at ham radio as a form of entertainment, and I guess there's nothing really wrong with that. It is a form of entertainment, but they don't see it as a learning tool that much. Now, that could be combated a little more effectively, I think.
Do you think we don't appreciate learning new stuff the same way we did when we were younger as a society?
Well, I won't say that because it depends on what stuff you're learning. To most people, I ran to somebody else and they asked me a hobby. I said, I have my amateur radio license. And the guy said, they don't have that anymore, with an air of authority, like he knew what he was talking about. Like, they dropped that years ago. No, they didn't. And in fact, I keep a laminated copy of the license in my wallet. So I pulled it out and showed it to him. And he said, well, you've had this many years. Yes, I have. Well, they just don't have ham radio anymore. I said, well, it's funny. I'll tell the people I talk to on ham radio that I'm not really talking to them. And because of ham radio, somebody put a real cute meme on Facebook a while back and said, ham radio, the original social connection device. And I thought that's very true. It really, really was and is, but most people today don't see it as that. A, it's too slow. B, there's a feeling in the United States that's very pervasive that anything more than 5 years has to be bad by definition because it's more than 5 years old. Well, look how old ham radio is compared to that, so it must be really bad.
I guess I'm thinking that, and maybe I see this on Facebook, and maybe Facebook's is the wrong place to be looking on it, but I made a post recently about a new technology that's being developed. I won't go into detail in terms of what that technology is, other than to say that a group of people is working on a new technology, and the response from some of the people was, well, we already have a technology that does that. Why would we want to do anything different? And I guess, is it generational, or is it the way that we manage people's expectations? That the great thing about amateur radio is that we try to do themes and variations on the technologies we know to make the technologies better, or to make them more efficient, or to reduce the cost of the project, or to just kind of go where no one's gone before. Do you get a sense that that is kind of being lost in our translation of amateur radio to other people?
Yeah, I do, because there's an old phrase about, and it applies to other hobbies as well, but it certainly does apply to amateur radio, about people vomiting amateur radio all over somebody else, and I think you know what I mean about that. They just go into sensory overload because they're telling them too many things at one time. When somebody just asks a polite question about it, we do need to address that issue so that we can find that person's hot button, if he has one, or she for that matter, and show them how something in ham radio might be able to help them quench that fire they may have for that one hot button issue.
Well, I think the idea that amateur radio is too expensive, it's very interesting that for some reason, and I've said this many times, so I always am begging the patience of the listeners, and that is that many of us old-timers who've been in ham radio forever, we have so much equipment that's, either in the attic or it's in the basement or it's, on the shelf somewhere, that if we had the right student, that we would set them up with a full station. It might be old stuff, but it's good working stuff. And it seems to me that never comes up, that everyone thinks that they've got to go to the nearest ham radio store and spend thousands of dollars in order to be able to enjoy amateur radio. I think somehow we're not communicating what we can do as hams who've been in the game for a lot of years.
Oh, I would agree totally with you on that. My Swan 270, which is out in the garage, that is as I said, my Elmering rig. One of the disc jockeys at one of the radio stations I worked at here in town, he saw my call sign plates on my truck and would ask all kinds of questions about it. And I had a 2-meter FM in it at the time, and we'd go to lunch, and I'd bring that on and show it to him. And then you'd ask about the remote base. When I had that going here, he thought that was really neat that you could use a walkie-talkie and still work around the world on it. And so he was interested. So I set him up with that Swan, and we made him basically the same vertical that you saw on that article in QST, and he loved it. He he did upgrade to general. That's as far as he's gone, but he's still licensed.
It's great in that you have that and that you're willing to share, and I think that's kind of what I've always thought made the hams I know different, was that they were always willing to share with other people. Now, you mentioned the remote base. I saw that in an article that you wrote a simple COR circuit for, I think it was Hinson Kinks in QST magazine, but you said it took you some time to make it. Could you just explain what that remote base was, and did you run it from your house?
No, I didn't. Well, for testing I did, but once I got it completed, I moved it. It was 2-meter FM in and 10-meter FM out. I went in, I used a regular matched pair, 146, 3-1 in, 9-1 out, just like you're using a regular in-band repeater. But then what went in on 146, 3-1 didn't come out on 9-1. It came out on 29.6, which is the FM calling frequency on 10 meters. And then 10 meters, 29.6 back in, came out on 146, 9-1. And it worked real well. Just had a Motorola Mocom 10 on 10 meters and several various rigs. In fact, the first incarnation used vacuum tubes. It used a Tube Compa base station for 10 meters and a GE Prog line for 2 meters in a 6-foot high rack cabinet. So it was really big, but it worked quite well. And then I built another incarnation of it that was totally solid state and mounted on one rack panel that was attached to a chassis that had the rest of the electronics on it. And for sites, I was lucky. Out east of Terre Haute, there was a Amex company coal mine that had been there since the 1930s, still in operation, and they had a coal silo that was 215 feet tall and about 50 feet in diameter. So I went out there and asked them if it would be possible to put a very small building up on top of that silo and radios and an antenna, and they liked the idea. They had to get the company permission, the corporate permission, but they did, and even the union people had no trouble with it. And so I had that remote base on top of that silo for several years. And it's funny, you have 2-meter transfer up there with, I think I had 12 feet of coax on it just to get outside the building on a little bracket to hold a gain antenna at 215 feet. It worked real well. So did the 10-meter. And then later I had it on a tower here in Terre Haute I had even a gain antenna for 10 meters on it, which that's no small feat in itself, but it worked real well for quite a while, but then started having some problems, and I lost that site, and they tore the tower down. So I have that up in the attic of the garage. Will I put it back on the air someday? Maybe, but there's no great rush on it. But it was a lot of fun for several years, and it's amazing because all the negativity I got from that first ham club. Oh, you can't do that. It's illegal. It's immoral. It's fattening. Whatever whatever excuse they wanted to make, they made it without checking. So I even called the FCC and talked to John Johnston, the Private Radio Bureau, about what I was doing. And he said, yes, that's perfectly legal as long as you identify it and you don't allow technicians who don't have the proper class license to it, because they're not allowed to put out any RF on 10 meters at that time. And so fine, I monitored it. And if somebody came on that I knew wasn't, I would hit the button and just, sorry, you're going off the air, Charlie. I talked all over the world on that thing, which was kind of cool.
Yeah, so I've never operated 29.6. I've got it now in the radio here, and so I'm listening just to see if there's any worldwide communications now as the cycle 25 is wrapping up. Jerry, what excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
The fact it's still here, despite what one expert told me, and the fact that I can come home. I'm retired now, but I still do the stuff. And when I come home, and if I care to, I can flip on a switch and hear almost anywhere in the United States, or depending on what band I go to, almost anywhere in the world. And I probably can talk to that person, which that is the excitement that got me into it in 1969, and it's still there today. So many people think I'm strange about that, but hey, you asked the question, that's why, the excitement of being able to have the possibility of doing that.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Oh, that's easy. Do not stagnate. A lot of places, they'll get you to the technician license. In fact, one of the clubs here, I understand why they did it, and it's a nice gesture, but to me, it's almost encouraging stagnation. If you go through their technician class course and pass it, they give you one of those, was it Beifong or whatever the name is?
Baofeng.
Baofeng, yeah.
Baofeng, Chinese radio.
Yeah, Chinese radio as your gift for passing it, and it's already pre-programmed with all the local repeaters. Well, they get all excited. Wow, a free gift for me with that. That's wonderful. And the aspect of a gift is wonderful, but you're limiting the guy to roughly 15 miles, from Terre Haute, maybe a little farther at times, and that won't keep their interest long enough for them to advance to other licenses and see the worldwide aspect of it. So it's almost making it self-defeating by that purpose. So to me, that was the incentive when I was a novice, because as you said, it was a 1-year license and it was non-renewable. So make it where, okay, again, put a little bit of urgency into what you're doing, and then mentor these people that there's a whole lot more than just a 2-meter repeater where you can talk across town.
Do you think we should bring back the novice license? And if we brought back the novice license, how should it be restricted in order to encourage some technical expertise? Because obviously to be a novice, at least when we got in, you kind of had to break all the rules as far as your parents were concerned and load up whatever you could as far as you could. Do you see that we could benefit as a service by bringing back some kind of novice license that had a very limited life on it?
I don't know if benefit's the right word. I would like to see it, however. But again, put some major restrictions on it, but then dangle the carrot in front of them. That's the one thing that we don't do in anything anymore is carrot dangling, if you understand what I mean by that. It's like, here, if you do this a little bit more, look what else you get. That has been considered everything from plain bad to racist, I'm sure, by some people. And you got to give people incentive to do that, which that would be very easy to do. Now, in the way of restrictions, no, we don't need to go back to crystal control like it was when I was a novice and you were too. But I think I would do band limitations. Back when I was a novice, you had 80, 40, and 15, and that was it. Of course, CW, when they did away with that, it was funny when they made that announcement, the media, national media, just tee and guffawed over that you mean there still are people who actually use Morse code, incredulously, because my God, that's so gauche to them.
Ancient.
Yeah, ancient. So I don't know if you made a novice license again with CW only, if you'd get anybody applying for it.
Well, how about FT8? How about a novice license on 3 bands that can work some digital modes? By upgrading, they'd get more bands of potential digital modes. You can build digital transceivers now for under $100.
Right. It's funny you said that, digital mode, because, of course, CW is a digital mode.
Right, of course, yeah.
I got in a huge argument with somebody about that at a Hamfest once, and he said, well, how's a digital mode? I said, well, let's define digital. 1s and 0s in a standardized coding format. Do we agree with that? Well, yeah. Well, guess what? CW has a standardized coding format. It's called Morse. Well, yeah, but you're not using a computer to receive it. Wait. We're not talking about what you're using to transmit or receive. We're talking about the mode. And he knew I had him on that one, so he just grumbled and walked away.
Well, okay. Look, I think there's always an opportunity to think about what the hooks are in order to get people on. I think, as you said earlier, and I echoed, is it's too bad that people think that it's an expensive hobby. I think the IC7300 that I own is probably the first new radio I ever purchased in my life. I think every radio from the very beginning was always some used surplus or something that I got second or third hand. Anyway, Jerry, it's such a pleasure to have you on the QSO Today podcast. I've enjoyed our conversation, and I want to wish you thank you very much. And 73, thanks for joining me.
Well, you're certainly welcome, Eric. I have one question for you, if that's okay.
Sure.
I'm so old-fashioned, I still send out QSL cards.
Uh-huh.
And I went to my book here, and only one letter away from you is a person I worked on 160, 4Z1UF. I was wondering if you know that person.
I've actually met him. As I recall, he was actually operating from a penthouse down on the coastal plain, and he had his 160-meter, I think it was just a long wire running from the penthouse down to a tree across the street, and I think he'd worked all states on 160 meters.
Ilya Zozin is his name.
I've met him in person.
It was my only Israel contact on 160, but the QSO card was very impressive. So
I'll tell you what, I'll send you a QSO Today QSL card so that we worked each other on QSO Today rather than on the air. But at some point, Jerry, I hope to work you on the air.
Yeah, what bands do you work?
Well, at the moment, I'm listening to 20 meter CW. So at some point, you'll have to listen for me on 20.
Well, I will, because I'm working on a homemade 5-band trap vertical. It covers 10, 12, 15, 17, and 20.
Very cool. I have a 100-foot inverted V that is fed with ladder line and has a tuner at the bottom. It works 40 through 6.
Okay, well, that's good.
That's the antenna.
Okay, so anyway, yeah, 160 is my favorite band. It has been for many years. I've got a quarter-wave vertical with 120 radials plowed in the ground underneath it, and it's since I'm a broadcaster, I use a good old General Instrument 1606A RF impedance bridge and set up the gamma match on it, and it's at 1.83, which was the design frequency. It shows 50 ohms J sub 0, and then since that time I bought one of those Rig Expert antenna analyzer. Wow, what a step forward that is. And so I thought, let's see how accurate the old 1606 was, and I put it on, and guess what? The Rig Blaster or Rig Expert says 50 ohms J0 at 1.83. So I guess the old technology worked back then.
You have a fair amount of acreage that you have all your antennas on?
Yeah, I've got 6 acres down here south of Terre Haute.
Well, with that, Jerry, I want to thank you very much, and thank you for joining me on the QSO Today podcast.
You're welcome, Eric. Hope to talk to you again. 73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Jerry. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K9AF in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.